Welcome back again. This presentation is on issues surrounding recruitment and ensuring we have enough people for the ADF. It is the second presentation in which I am looking at significant events well after they've happened and discussing their relevance and impact on both the DSR strategy of denial and the attritional strategy that I proposed in both my book and an earlier presentation. Honestly, as I looked into recruitment, it became a bit of a monster, so I've split it into two. Then after these two parts, I'll look at the PLA Navy's circumnavigation of Australia and then New Zealand's defence resurgence. Now, for this presentation, I will warn you that the conclusions I've drawn from this monster exercise are not what I expected, and I think they will challenge the standard narrative that you have heard. At a recent ASPI conference, the CDF Admiral Johnston warned that perhaps finally we're having to reconsider Australia as a homeland from which we will conduct combat operations. Ignoring his jargon, his words obviously call for an urgent action to avoid a crisis. In this two-part presentation, I will show that, unfortunately, in recruitment, the deeds of the ADF and the Defence Department do not actually portray that sense of urgency. I do tend to look at things differently, but I also do try to get as much data as possible before I make these presentations. Now, I do make mistakes, sometimes whoppers, but equally I do try to base conclusions on the data that I've dug up. Still, we all go into research with preconceived ideas that in general you expect the data to support either in part or in full. Rather arrogantly, I can honestly say that this is the first time that I ever had to change virtually 100% of my opinions. So let me start off with a straight out attack on what you probably believe and what I also believed before I started this analysis. It's based on two myths. The first myth stems from the fact that over the last few years, the Defence Department, ADF spokespersons, politicians and commentators have all complained about how difficult it is to find Australians willing to serve in the ADF. This communication strategy, and it really does come across as a communication strategy at times, was reinforced by a recent survey that had some allegedly scary results. Now, the second myth stemming from that same kind of communication strategy is that there is a retention crisis. I started looking at recruitment following a rather heated discussion in a Senate estimates hearing at the beginning of 2025. I was really quite surprised by the numbers and the conclusions to which they led. The net result is that both strategies, whether it be attrition or the DSR, are simply not possible, primarily due to the ADF's current recruitment policies and procedures. Another conclusion that was quickly stripped away was that, traditionally, we look at recruitment to boost ADF numbers, then separations, and then retention schemes to reduce separations. Instead, I now believe the issues with maintaining or increasing the ADF strength are best understood if we look at retention schemes first, then separations, and finally at the actual recruitment. Now, with apologies for the men and women in uniform, I know this section on retentions will be confrontational. Firstly, the current schemes are simply not working. I will discuss how both Bonus 1 and 2 and the Home Ownership Assistance Scheme are simply not targeting the right groups. Recruitment policy should not be about rewarding those who would stay regardless, nor bribing someone simply to keep numbers up. I'll look at incentives for enlisting and why we need them with my recommendations at the end of the second part of this presentation. One problem with the review of the retention schemes is that it's almost impossible to know the exact impact on the demographics within the ADF, simply because information is just not available. This leaves my analysis up for debate, but I think my conclusions are sound based on the available data. What we definitely know is the approximate cost of the two schemes. Combined, the Home Ownership Assistance Scheme and Bonus 1 and 2, when the latter comes into play, are well over $500 million a year. When this presentation moves on to separations, we can see that in the financial year ending 2024, the number of separations in the Army dropped more than you would expect, but roughly by 400 other ranks and 50 officers. As the drop in the ADF almost completely stems from the decline of the Army, those 450 retentions are the scheme's only proof of success. In other words, the retention schemes are not making any significant difference given their cost. One of those little statistical anomalies that I will discuss further is that if you applied the same extra retentions rates to the Navy and Air Force, then you'd be looking at retaining roughly an additional 1,000 ADF personnel. This is about what the Minister claimed. Even so, it ignores that the result makes these schemes seriously expensive. Unfortunately, the details on beneficiaries by rank, age and income are a jealously guarded secret, so it's hard to categorically state which groups are benefiting the most and those who are not benefiting at all. Still, naturally, using the data that is available, I will try and give it my best shot. There are two factors that determine the size of the ADF. The first is recruitment, obviously, but equally as important is separations. By that, defence means the number of personnel who leave the Defence Force either voluntarily or involuntarily. As I will discuss later in part 2, involuntary separations actually make quite a serious impact on the ADF's manpower reserves in a time of war. Interestingly, trying to minimise separations is actually far more expensive than the recruitment process. Rather surprisingly, Defence took the recruitment contract to tender and awarded it to a different company. What's really fascinating about that is that the new recruitment contract awarded to Adecco in 2022 doubled the cost of the previous contract and now averages a little over $200 million per year. Although Adecco is one of Australia's leading employment agencies, Defence provided no justification whatsoever to explain why Australian taxpayers needed to cough up an extra $2 million a week for another company to run the same recruitment process. There does seem to be additional features to the Adecco contract to reflect that cost, and I'll discuss its impact in part 2. Still, even though the yearly cost of recruitment has doubled, it is still far less than half the cost of the two main retention schemes, that is, Home Ownership Assistance Scheme and Bonus 1 and 2. As the ADF recruitment target is a little over $10,000 per year, this gives an average cost per recruit of approximately $20,000, compared to a minimum retention cost of $200,000 for per retained ADF member. Obviously, there is a vast difference between a recruit and a highly experienced NCO, but you have to be careful about what estimated savings can come from their retention. The ADF must maintain a dedicated pipeline for the continual training of recruits, specialists, technicians and leaders. Unlike private industry, it cannot rely on vocational and leadership training through the public system, as, firstly, the ADF clearly needs a different skill set, and secondly, it must maintain an effective training capacity that can be expanded in the event of war. Therefore, the ADF cannot readily obtain financial savings by reducing its internal training infrastructure, either in terms of experienced NCOs to do the training or the facilities they use. And any attempt to do so verges on criminal negligence. Now, the debate over retention is one of apples and oranges. Do you pay extra to retain people who may not even want to be in the ADF? Or do you increase the training pipeline so that it provides enough trained people to the expected level to cover those separations? I'm actually going to look now to see if there is a third option. Now, to my mind, the aim of any retention scheme should be on keeping people with experience, and determining that experience is the real challenge. I've mentioned the Rwanda deployment from 93 to 96 in earlier presentations. Honestly, if you can, you should read about this deployment in Volume 4 of the official history. One of the lessons that came out of Rwanda was the lack of trauma experience for some ADF medical personnel, which led to changes in their training. What I'm trying to get at is that post-Rwanda, there were three types of experience for ADF medical staff. They were time served, length of time with trauma experience from embedding in Australian hospitals, and of course field experience from time spent in Rwanda. In implementing retention schemes, you first must decide which or all of these types of experience you wish to retain. Rather than targeted retentions, it actually plays out differently under the current system. I'll use another example from the Navy. Right now, you will have sailors with multiple levels of experience. However, it's not that one is better than the other, it's that each potentially provides a different level of expertise. They include time served of 7 years with recent updated training, time served of 12 years with experience in the Indian Ocean boarding refugee boats, mass rescues and body recovery, time served of 15 years with experience in anti-piracy operations off the African coast. Personally, I find it difficult to understand how the last two levels of experience miss out on bonus 1 and 2. Actually, I'll take that back. In my opinion, it's the height of stupidity, and, in fact, I will go further and state bonus 1 and 2, given their cost, do not really benefit the ADF at all. A retention scheme should not be a broad sweep. It should be individually targeted and include those reaching 4 and 7 year service, but showing enthusiasm through measurable achievements and/or specialist skills. Equally, just because you're on a ship in the Gulf doesn't mean that you add any extra value to the Navy that also deserves a bonus. Obviously, in terms of managing who should get the benefits and governance to make sure the process is not abused, a broad sweep retention scheme like the one we have now is a far, far easier option for ADF and defence leadership. If this is the best we can do, we probably shouldn't do it at all. So now, having half the Defence Force ready to kill me over stating that bonus 1 and 2 target the wrong members of the ADF and are far too expensive for the results, I'll now move on and get another 10% of the ADF ready to include me on their collection of enemy silhouettes. It's time for a look at the other major retention scheme. The Home Ownership Assistance Scheme is very interesting. It is also very difficult to assess whether it benefits retentions at all. In fact, as I'll discuss a little later on career choke points, it's quite possible that it actually encourages the wrong cohort to leave. However, unlike bonus 1 and 2, it does have clear benefits for warlike service, but strangely, it is by extending the length of the term of a DHOS subsidy for an ADF member. Quite simply, the benefit of these extra credits are only really obtained and are in fact maximised by the veteran if they actually leave the ADF. That's seriously weird if you are trying to retain personnel with this type of experience for as long as possible. Ignoring that detour, the emphasis on length of service is interesting. How much you can borrow is actually the determining factor of their subsidy. Their length of service is almost irrelevant. Let me explain. Borrowing capacity is a fluid concept. The base borrowing capacity for an ADF member is their income. Quite simply, the higher the wage, the more they can borrow. However, the borrowing amount can, as an example, increase due to a partner's income or even decline due to dependents and other loans. For ease of comparison, I am looking purely at the sole income of an ADF member. Based on ADF data, when the top tier kicks in after 8 years of service, Corporal is the highest NCO rank you could have obtained, while the highest officer rank you could have attained is that of Captain. Therefore, in theory, both a Captain and Corporal can earn the maximum monthly subsidy. The problem is that, based purely on sole incomes, the borrowing capacity for a Corporal maxes out at Tier 2, even though they have theoretically reached Tier 3. At that same 8-year mark, the borrowing for a capacity for a Captain is more than enough to receive the Tier 3 subsidy. The scheme clearly favours those with an income that enables them to borrow the highest amount, and that obviously means officers. I'll be talking about career choke points later, but the choke points for officers is the promotion from major. In other words, the scheme not only favours officers, but when it kicks in, it rewards the very officers who are least likely to leave the ADF. Once again, there is a lack of data. While many ADF members may use the scheme, it is pretty clear that the highest percentage using the scheme by rank would be captains and higher and senior NCOs. The highest amount subsidised per individual would favour those same ranks. Yet, we are told the retention problem is a loss of too many specialists and junior NCOs, while for officers, as I will discuss a little later, the real retention problem is at the rank of lieutenant. Neither junior officers or junior NCOs are likely to be major beneficiaries of this scheme. If so, then this scheme is missing the target by a mile. While exact figures are unknown, the cost of the scheme indicates that only about 1 in 4 ADF members are beneficiaries, plus an unknown number of ADF members who have separated. We simply do not know how many are in this later group, nor how long the subsidies will continue after they have left the ADF. That there is a major benefit for former ADF members is, again, seriously weird. If we cancel the scheme and instead put it into each sailor's, soldiers' and airmen's pockets, we could increase the pay of every single ADF member by $4,000 a year. So, in targeting cost and outcomes, this scheme just seems quite bizarre. Now it's time to get into the numbers for the ADF and the Army. Before I go on, I have to say that these numbers are sometimes all over the place. As an example, at Senate estimates, issues such as recruitment are referred to by calendar year, sometimes not. In the annual report, they are by financial year. At times, I was unable to find comparable numbers in every year's budget papers. In this presentation, the following data is all obtained from Defence budget papers that provide actual ADF numbers for previous years. So this is the strength of the ADF since 2012. I don't think anybody will be surprised here. There are 2 periods when there is a noticeable drop in the ADF strength. These 2 declines are completely due to the drop in Army numbers. In fact, the decline starting in 2022 would have been even worse if not for the fact that the strength of the Navy and Air Force averaged an increase every year. Therefore, in general, I will focus on the Army unless stated otherwise. The historical data suggests the Army had no problems maintaining a strength of 30,000 for a decade. However, there are 2 anomalies that need explanation. The first is in 2013 and 2014, largely associated with the end of the Afghanistan deployments. There is no real surprise for the reduction in 2013, as it tends to happen after any prolonged deployment. But please note that it bounced back very quickly. The next starts in 2022 is far more pronounced, and we are yet to see any bounce back. This anomaly is what I'll look at in greater depth. Specifically, I'm going to look at whether this decline is due to separations. As I warned, there's a fair bit of number crunching in this presentation. At this point, I'm swapping over to separations and looking at if there is an actual crisis. One basis for the myth is what is known as the separation rate. It has climbed steadily since 2019. It is calculated by the number of separations as a percentage of the size of the Army. The first thing I want to show is that actual numbers are not always reflected in these statistical percentages. This is an example of what I mean. For the financial year ending 2020, the separation rate was 11% for 3,225 actual. For the financial year ending 2024, the separation rate increased to 11.5%, but in numbers was lower at 3,140 actual. So how can the percentage be higher, but the actual number of separations be lower? The reason is that although the number of separations are close, the strength of the Army has declined quite substantially, by almost 3,000, or about 10% of its strength, and this created the variation in the separation rates. As Defence routinely quotes these percentages as proof of a retention crisis, I needed to explain why we have to have a little bit deeper of a look to see if separations are actually a reason for this fairly dramatic fall in the Army's strength. Lacking specific data for most of these years, this red line is a bit of a supposition, but it's borne out by the data that I will present over the next few minutes. It represents separations in comparison to the strength of the Army. If the red line is above the Army strength, then the separation as a percentage will be higher. If it is below the strength of the Army, the separation rate will be lower. The changes in separation rates as a percentage are greatest immediately after there is a significant change in relative strength. This is because the number of soldiers leaving the Army after the end of their first term of enlistment at 4 years is a primary driver of separations. But a secondary driver is the number of ORs who leave the Army with their career stalling at the choke point for the rank of corporal, or at what I call the 7-year itch. Obviously, the bigger the Army, the more separations, but those separations don't hit for another 4 to 7 years and will happen regardless of the future size of the Army. So in 2013 and 2014, you would see a rise in the separation rate because the Army strength dropped. But then separation rates would seem to improve from 2017 as the Army strength recovered. Then once the Army recovered its strength and stabilised, the Army's separation rate would also plateau. However, the Army's strength again started to drop in 2022. You can see that there's a growing gap between the number of separations represented by the red line and the size of the Army. The red arrows show when the two separation drivers start to kick in for each year. So the fourth year separations for 2019 do not kick in until 2023 and so on. The Army strength remained fairly high until 2021. Therefore, the number of separations due to those who leave after 4 years does not start to decline until 2025. When that happens, separations will decrease in actual numbers and the separation rate should start to decline. And this is exactly what we are seeing. The second driver, those leaving due to the 7-year itch, doesn't kick in until after 2028. What I am trying to say in my usual long-winded way is that separation rates should be based on the Army strength as it was 4 to 7 years earlier, which means that the so-called separation crisis we are experiencing now simply does not exist. It's just a statistical anomaly. However, the Army is obviously declining. We can see that. So, ignoring percentages, how is the actual number of separations impacting this decline? This is separations compared to actual changes in the Army strength. The blue are the separation, the red are the changes in Army numbers. You can see that apart from 2021, which I'll talk about later, the Army's numbers dropped every year, regardless of changes to the number of separations. The number of separations generally increased to the 2022 peak, which is exactly 4 years after the Army reached its maximum size in 2018. As noted previously, you would naturally expect a drop in separations starting around 2024. I would note the interesting drop in the 2020 separations. That's exactly 7 years after the Army's lowest strength in 2013. So again, you would expect the number of separations from the 7-year itch to also be at its lowest. Now you can see that the 7-year itch is an important driver, but nowhere near as important as those 4-year separations. However, 2020 is still a bit lower, and 2022 quite a bit higher than what I expected. I'll go into that soon in greater detail. So, separations peak in 2021 and then began their steady decline exactly as you would expect, but then dropped quite remarkably in 2024. The later is also quite fascinating, and it's something else I'll get into. However, it's pretty clear that the drop in the Army strength by years was only marginally affected by changes in separations. If you look at 2022 compared to 2019, separations have indeed increased by another 289, but the Army's strength fell even faster, losing an additional 536. Comparing 2024 to 2019 is really interesting. Separations actually dropped quite dramatically, but the Army still lost even more of its strength. The changes in the number of separations was almost irrelevant to the rate at which the Army was losing numbers. In fact, as the number of separations declined, we should have started to see the Army's strength quickly recover, just as we saw after the drop in strength after 2013 and 2014. That is, in itself, is quite interesting, and it actually provides the first clue. Separations were simply not driving the Army's decline in strength. Something else was happening. Let's look at the 2022 and 2024 separation anomalies. As the Army strength plateaued, separations started to pretty well stabilise around that 3,500 mark, but there were still fluctuations. There was only a marginal decline in the size of the Army from 2019 to 2020, so you would expect only a marginal decline in separations from 2023 to 2024. This is obviously not the case. The answer is that in 2024, bonus 1 kicked in. Nevertheless, you can see that the impact was really quite small. At best, it was somewhere around 400 less separations that year than you would normally expect. As I've noted, the 2022 peak was 4 years after the maximum size the Army reached, but the separation rates that year were still far too high. In 2018, the Army strength was 500 higher than the previous year, So you would expect the increase in separations to be a proportion of that 500. So the 2022 increase of 274 actual separations was, to me, unexpected. After a little cross-checking, the answer was quite surprising. That's because what we started to see in 2020 was something quite strange, and that was dramatic swings in officer separations every year. In 2020, officer separations dropped by 100 actual. That 100 actual, plus the expected impact of a decline in the 7-year itch from 2013, were completely responsible for that year's total overall decline in separations. It was followed by a jump in 2022. This jump is one of those absolutely astonishing events. It was driven by a whopping 30% increase in officer separations, or 124 actual, compared to 2020. It stands out as substantially higher than any other year since the Army has started losing its strength. Officer separations were almost completely responsible for the larger than expected jump in 2022, as well as over 50 extra separations the next year. That's fascinating in its own right, and I'll look at possible reasons a bit further on, but to my knowledge, no one in defence has really tried to explain the massive swings in officer separations that we have seen in the last 5 years. Excluding officers, these separations for other ranks show a remarkable consistency compared to the Army strength at 4 and 7 years earlier. This is what makes the large drop in separations in 2024 so interesting. As I've said, it was the year that bonus 1 kicked in, and it did make a difference. Navy and Air Force personnel were also eligible, but I'm going to stay focused on the Army because this is where the biggest swings in numbers happen. As noted, in 2024, the Army appears to have massively reduced separations by 400. Why I'm bringing this up again is because what's interesting is who stayed. I'm going to discuss career choke points because this really is quite interesting and it will help me explain what is happening. The red line is the range of years required to obtain that promotion. If you disagree, don't blame me, blame defence. This is the best data I can find. Note I haven't gone above the rank of sergeant. The green bars show bonus 1 and 2. Bonus 1 now overwhelmingly applies to the rank of Lance Corporal or lower. Bonus 2 will apply purely to the rank of Corporal or lower. The black horizontal lines are when the Home Ownership Assistance Scheme kicks in by level and year. In terms of promotion, you can see that for other ranks, the real issue is one of supply. When bonus 1 kicks in, very few will have achieved the rank of Corporal, and some will not have achieved that rank before bonus 2 kicks in. In fact, a large number of bonus 1 and 2 beneficiaries will not have achieved either rank. Then there's not enough opportunities above Corporal. I know it's a bit more complicated than that. By these maps, there's simply not enough opportunities, so there is quite an increase in the length of time taken to gain promotion to Sergeant. This is the obvious reason for the second choke point kicking in at the 7-year mark. Although bonus 2 encourages Corporals especially to stay on, all it does is transfer the choke point to the 10-year mark, which is the orange line. Very few will have become sergeants by their 10th year. Nothing will have changed if they only stayed on for the bonus or for career opportunities. However, at this point, the two incentives actually start working against each other. Length of service, higher pay due to rank and increments, all enable sergeants and above to gain bigger benefits from the Home Ownership Assistance Scheme, and therefore stay in service. I do not know how much separations have changed by rank because of this scheme, and as well as its recent change in benefits. So this is actually a question that I simply can't answer. To be honest, I am not sure anyone in defence is even looking. Now I'd love to be able to delve into this further if I could get my hands on the data, but there is just enough here to support most points I've made. As an example, it supports roughly a 3,000 per year turnover for the ranks of Lance Corporal and lower, and about a 200 a year turnover or attrition rate for the ranks of Sergeant and above. That implies about 400 per year leaving the Army at the 7-year mark, and that pretty well is the reduction we are seeing. In fact, we could have predicted it when bonus 1 kicked in. However, if bonus 1 increases retentions by about 400, the pressure on the choke point for promotion to Corporal will increase, but by how much is the question. This is really quite a fascinating topic, but one that doesn't seem to have any good outcomes for the Army. Interestingly, the ANAO pretty well states that the Army itself has no real idea of what the outcome will be from all this expense. Back to the numbers. If a yearly increase of 400 soldiers is maintained, then within 3 years there'll be an extra 1,200 personnel looking for a promotion to either Lance Corporal or Corporal. Without additional opportunities for promotion, the extra 1,200 means a blowout in the average time taken to achieve any promotion. If they do not achieve it, or the reason they stayed on was for the retention bonus, then they are most likely to leave as soon as possible. Bluntly, all you're doing with bonus 1 and 2 is kicking the can 3 years down the road to what is becoming the 10-year choke point. Equally, the maths simply doesn't change. If you artificially lower the separation rates now by bribing people to stay who would otherwise have left, then the separation rates will skyrocket once this cohort runs out of bonuses and simultaneously has no career prospects. In the interim, it is the new recruits who will pay the price due to less opportunities for promotion for themselves. If the average time taken to become a Lance Corporal blows out by a couple of years to 5 years, and for a Corporal to between 9 and 12 years, that is, how many will wait despite any bonus? Alternatively, possibly the worst thing that could happen is that there is a massive increase in the ratio of NCOs to lower ranks. Increasing the number of NCOs in proportion to privates just blows out costs for the Army, both in the short term through bonuses and in the longer term through higher average pays because of the increased number of NCOs. It's also very doubtful whether the training pipeline for sergeants can quickly increase without compromising the quality. It's quite possible that due to bonus 1 and 2, if the number of promotions is not carefully managed, the Army could wind up with more Lance Corporals and Corporals than they have privates. The only way to avoid the problems caused by the bonus scheme, that is, either a lack of career opportunities for new recruits or significantly increasing the ratio of senior NCOs, is to have a continual expansion of the Army. But as I will explain in part 2, for a variety of reasons, that is not going to happen for at least the remainder of this decade, if at all. The 2024 drop in separations by 400 is actually an early indicator of what will become the true separation crisis. This is why we really need to look at the long-term problems and benefits of these bonus schemes. This is exactly the same comparison for officers. What is interesting for officers is that there is no choke point comparable to that of a recruit eventually gaining the rank of corporal. However, there are still 2 choke points. The first is that for the promotion from major. Still, in comparison to a recruit, the ratio of lieutenant colonels to lieutenants is much higher than that of sergeants to private. So a lieutenant is 3 times more likely to eventually achieve that rank than for a recruit to become a sergeant. And that lieutenant will also progress through the lower officer ranks much faster. What I'm trying to say is that an officer's career will progress quite dramatically compared to a recruit's, even without any retention scheme. Therefore, for officers at the rank of captain or above, the DHOAS is just icing on the cake. It's also really, really thick icing due to their increased borrowing capacity and access to higher subsidies. However, because the maximum benefit of the DHOAS fully kicks in for officers at year 8, that is at the point in which the scheme actually starts pushing back at officer career progression, and I'll explain that a little bit. Finally, you can see the second choke point is for promotion above colonel. At a combined total of under 300 colonels and star ranked officers, this is a very close-knit group, and it's quite interesting. In fact, this group already acts as an example. We are seeing evidence of a retention crisis reflected amongst the growth in star ranked officers. Under any Army structure, there is effectively a finite limit on the number of positions below those star ranked. In theory, there are only so many captains, majors, and colonels needed. Not so for star ranked officers. As an example, an Army procurement may originally have had a single 1-star officer, which is then split into 2 positions, but now you need a senior officer to oversee both. That same project now has a 2-star officer and 2 1-star officers. Creating those 2 extra 1-star positions creates far more career opportunities in a year than would normally be available due to retirement. And this is very important for this little group. While nearly everybody complains about this type of growth by stealth in the ADF's top leadership, few really ask why. The real answer is that this kind of job creation happens if your retention program is out of control. If the benefits are weighted towards the top, then there is reluctance to move on once your career peaks. It means less opportunities for colonels to be promoted, and down the chain it goes until the lieutenants realise their career opportunities are shot, and their separations will increase as a result. One way to overcome this problem is to end careers by mandate, but that's not the easiest thing to do for a wide variety of reasons. Instead, if you look at this promotion table for star-ranked officers, by creating 10 one-star positions in 2024, the Army was able to promote an extra 10 colonels. Proportionally, the percentage increase for the RAAF was about the same as the Army, but unsurprisingly, the Navy created twice as many star-ranked officers relative to its size. You can see the benefit of the Naval Shipbuilding Program for inflating positions for the senior service. While the number of additional promotion opportunities seems a small amount compared to the number of colonel equivalents, it still meant an average ADF-wide increase in promotion opportunities of over 5% for colonel equivalents in 1 year. That is really quite an extraordinary amount. However, if your retention scheme is encouraging senior officers to hang around, then you have to keep on creating positions, because if you don't, the number of career opportunities for colonel equivalents decline. You are not solving the problem caused by a retention system heavily weighted to senior management. Instead, you are just putting it off for another year while simultaneously increasing the size and costs of the ADF senior leadership. I would argue that this is the primary driver behind the huge jump in the number of star-ranked officers, while simultaneously having the total strength of the Army decline by 10%. The true retention crisis gets worse as you go down officer ranks because of declining career opportunities. Their separation rates actually increase because 10 extra star-ranked officers barely makes ripple in the opportunities for majors and below, but retention schemes like the DHOIS also discourages middle ranking officers who may have left from doing so. The real crisis in this type of scheme is not just that the number of star-ranked officers increase, although that is a problem in its own right, but that you end up with an officer corps whose average age steadily increases over time. If that happens, it is a terrible outcome. The problem is that it's a slow creep. Historically, the shift towards older officers holding the ranks of major and higher is difficult to recognise until one day you wake up and find an officer corps full of old men with white moustaches. However, an early sign of this happening is a loss of promotion opportunities in the lowest officer ranks. This is something we may be experiencing, as junior officers for the entire ADF are an astonishing 1,700 below the budget forecast. The shortfall in these ranks alone is about 2% of the total ADF strength. I will emphasise that it is beyond my abilities to confirm or deny whether my conclusion is even part of the reason for this shortfall. However, to my knowledge, such information as trends in the average age for officer ranks is another one of those carefully guarded defence secrets. Back to the issue of whether separations are really the problem. Information on the Army's actual intake is not easy to find, but there is a simple number that determines a growth or decline in the Army strength, and that is achieved by the difference between separations and intake. Obviously, if the intake is higher than separations, the strength of the Army grows. Just as obviously, if it is lower than the number of separations, then the strength of the Army declines. We know the Army strength and separations by year, so this is the intake number for the Army based on those stats. The intake needed for the Army to maintain its strength around that 30,000 mark is an average of about 3,600 per year. This is the red line on this chart. This is roughly the intake number it needed to recover from that 2013-2014 slump following Afghanistan, and it's the number it needed to maintain its strength of 30,000 for a better part of a decade. As you can see, except for 2021, the average intake was already 10% below that needed to maintain the Army, and as I've shown, the actual number of separations were acceptable given its previous size. It is very clear that the drop in the Army's intake was the reason its strength collapsed, and separations had little to do with it. However, there was that massive increase in the intake in 2021. It was in response to the COVID epidemic, the COVID epidemic's economic impact and the government using the army to suck up a few unemployed. I would note that the APS, that is the Australian Public Service, increased by 5% that same year for much the same reason. Regardless, 2021 showed that the Army could achieve a significant larger intake and should have easily maintained itself since 2019. Instead, since 2019, it did the reverse, and the Army intake dropped quite dramatically. In fact, in 2024, its intake was barely enough to maintain an Army of around 26,000. Therefore, the reason the Army has declined has nothing to do with separations, but is simply due to a collapse in the Army's intake that really commenced in 2019. Yet, as I discussed earlier, the reduced numbers in the Army actually made the separation rates increase. Confused? Well, when you just listen to Defence, you tend to trust their numbers because it can be confusing. That's exactly what happened to me. Trust is a mistake in the world of Australian Defence public announcements. In reality, the announced jump in the percentage of separations is just a statistical sleight of hand that covered up serious mismanagement in the Army's intake. It is overwhelmingly the Army's problem, as neither the Air Force or Navy were affected. In fact, both increased their strength by just under 1,000 each. Quite simply, there is no retention problem. It's a myth. There is an intake problem, but the question is what's causing it. I'll look at that in part 2, but first another of my detours. Before I finish this part, I would like to raise a separate indirect discussion on the ADF. Specifically, has it become a corporation, or more accurately, is it now behaving as a corporation? This is not idle musing. In my book, I warned of a growing disconnect between its leadership and the men and women putting in the hard yards. Equally, the constant emphasis on increasing benefits was putting the professional ADF, or at least its leadership, at risk of becoming a mercenary organisation with a corporate structure and managerial focus. While everybody would like more, and I'm myself included there, the reality is that the starting salary for a private in the Army, ignoring benefits, is the equivalent of a public servant at an APS 4 level, and many of them are supervising junior staff. If the ADF is beginning to operate more like a corporation, the question is, what does that actually mean for the ADF? It is an issue that I'll come back to later as well in the next part, but for the moment I'm going to ask if there is any benefit to the Army as a corporate entity of having a 10% drop in its strength, or of about 3,000 personnel. The ADF was actually struggling financially in 2019. The $50 billion tenant for the Hunter frigates was being finalised and already looking like there would be massive cost overruns. The attack class submarines had an estimated budget of $90 billion and was already in serious trouble. These two projects alone would add an average of about $5.5 billion per year to the defence budget. In comparison, the Army's budget for both acquisitions and sustainment was a fraction of that cost at about $4 billion per year. In fact, the total ADF acquisition budget would need to increase by 50% a year just for these two naval projects. In addition, the F-35 acquisition was being finalised, the troubled Hawkeye was running well over budget, money was still being thrown at the Taipans, and modern IFVs were desperately needed. It's not that the Army acquisition and sustainment budget was high, it was that the cost of these big ticket items was putting fairly significant financial pressure on the Army. As usual, projects were delayed as money was shuffled from one project to another, and in general, it appears that the Army was the one who missed out. In 2019, Angus Campbell was CDF, and he was well aware of these additional costs, as did the rest of the Army's leadership. This is where the concept of the ADF as a corporate entity comes into the mix. Simplistically, there are three corporate components: corporate leadership, capital costs, and labour costs. Corporate leadership and capital costs are largely fixed, the former because the leadership team is more committed to themselves than the corporation's health. If a corporation wants to increase its profit, then the preferred variable to manage is labour costs. No surprise there. We've all seen the big banks and others cut thousands of staff at the drop of a hat while salaries for the big boys and corporate profits go through the roof. But the Army can't sack people. However, if the Army reduces its intake to roughly 3,000, it will cut its workforce by roughly 400 per year. Nobody is sacked, but something interesting happens. The separation rates go up. This means that externally it is presented as a retention problem that requires additional funding to prevent. Meanwhile, as the size of the Army decreases, the savings are quite extraordinary. Just at a private's wage, reducing the Army by 10% would save it, at a minimum, $250 million a year. Other savings would be minimal, but it's not unreasonable to say that the yearly savings to the Army's budget, were at least $300 million every year, and quite possibly higher. As a percentage of the total ADF budget, it's not a lot, although $300 million is not to be sneezed at. But as a percentage of the Army's acquisition budget, this saving represents upwards of 20%. This is an enormous amount of money when the Army is being squeezed. The issue is whether the Army's leadership, acting as a management of a corporate entity, deliberately let its strength fall, or is it just the plain old incompetence that we've come to expect? Of course, there is a third option pushed by both the ADF and Defence. In Part 2, I will address the second myth, which is that the ADF cannot get enough recruits.